Rome, 222 AD. A teenage emperor dies screaming in a palace bathroom. He's butchered by his own bodyguards. The soldiers drag his corpse through the streets as crowds cheer. His head goes on a spear, his body into the Tiber. The most powerful person on earth, dead at 18, hated by literally everyone. His name was Elagabalus. He ruled for less than 4 years. What did this kid do to make an entire empire celebrate his murder? Here are the 5 most horrific things Emperor Elagabalus did that shocked even the Romans. To understand how a Syrian teenager became the most hated man in Roman history, we need to go back to 218 AD. The empire was drowning in chaos. Emperor Caracalla had been assassinated by his own soldiers while urinating on the side of a road during a military campaign. His successor, Macrinus, was struggling to maintain control. Into this power vacuum stepped one of the most ambitious women in Roman history, Julia Maesa. Maesa was no ordinary grandmother. She was the sister of Julia Domna, the powerful Syrian empress. When her sister died, Maesa found herself wealthy but politically sidelined. She wasn't about to accept that fate quietly. Back in the Syrian city of Emesa, she had a teenage grandson named Varius Avitus Bassianus. Everyone knew him by his religious title, Elagabalus, high priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabal. From childhood, this boy had served in the temple, performing sacred rituals that would seem utterly alien to traditional Romans. Maesa began spreading a lie that would change history. That young Elagabalus was actually the illegitimate son of the popular former emperor Caracalla. This was complete fiction. Caracalla had never even met the boy. But the Syrian legions were homesick, frustrated, and eager for any excuse to rebel. In May 218 AD, the Third Gallic Legion proclaimed 14-year-old Elagabalus as emperor. Within months, Macrinus was dead, and a teenage Syrian priest was marching toward Rome with the most powerful army in the world at his back. When news reached the capital that their new ruler was a 14-year-old boy who worshipped a foreign god, many Romans were willing to give him a chance. After all, the empire had survived young emperors before. How bad could this Syrian kid be? They were about to find out. What arrived in Rome in 219 AD wasn't just a foreign teenager with unusual religious practices. It was unlimited power in the hands of someone who seemed to view other human beings as toys to be played with and broken. The Romans were no strangers to violence, but they liked it in the right place, at the right time. The arena was for gladiators, the forum for executions. Your dining room? Not so much. Elagabalus had different ideas. According to historian Cassius Dio, the young emperor hosted dinner parties where condemned prisoners were torn apart by wild animals while guests tried to eat. Picture Rome's elite in their finest togas trying to enjoy roasted peacock while lions ripped people apart 10 feet away. But here's the sick part. Guests who tried to leave found guards blocking the exits. Elagabalus wanted everyone to watch his power over life and death. The screams of the dying mixed with tearing flesh and animal roars. Blood splattered across marble floors and silk cushions. Herodianus describes how some guests would sit in horrified silence. Many were too shocked to even vomit despite the gore surrounding them. Meanwhile, the teenage emperor would laugh and applaud like he was at the theater. He'd make jokes about the victim's final moments. He'd critique his animal's performance like a sports commentator. This wasn't justice, or even normal Roman cruelty. This was pure sadism, treating human death like dinner theater for a psychopath with unlimited power. The psychological impact on Rome's ruling class was immediate. These were men who had commanded legions and governed provinces. Now they found themselves captive audiences for a teenager who viewed human suffering as entertainment. Many later testified that these dinner parties haunted their dreams for years. Speaking of dinner parties gone wrong, Elagabalus had an even more creative way to kill his guests. He commissioned a special mechanical device installed in his banquet hall ceiling. Compartments that could release massive amounts of flower petals at the pull of a lever. The Banquet of Roses was months in the planning. He invited 200 of Rome's most important citizens to what seemed like the ultimate party trick. When the evening began, guests admired the mysterious ceiling fixtures. They wondered what surprise their eccentric young emperor had planned. Then the petals began to fall like gentle snow. At first, guests were genuinely delighted. They laughed, they caught the falling blooms, they breathed in the intoxicating fragrance. Some composed impromptu poems about the beauty of the moment. But the petals kept falling. What had started as a charming shower became a torrent. The delicate roses that seemed so beautiful moments before began piling up on dining couches. They spilled onto floors. They accumulated in ever-growing drifts around the room. The first panic came when guests tried to brush petals from their faces. For every handful they cleared, 10 more fell to replace them. The sweet fragrance became cloying, then suffocating. People realized they were literally drowning in luxury. Some tried to reach the exits. They discovered guards at every door. Others attempted to burrow through the accumulating flowers. They gasped for air as petals threatened to bury them alive. The mechanical system continued for over an hour. It released tons of flower petals into the sealed room. Cassius Dio records that several people died that night from suffocation under mountains of roses. They died surrounded by beauty. They were overwhelmed by symbols of love and celebration. Elagabalus watched from his protected imperial platform. He studied his guests' terror with detached scientific curiosity. When later asked why he had done such a thing, he reportedly said he wanted to discover whether someone could die of too much beauty. Now we get to the stuff that really made Romans lose their minds. Romans weren't opposed to homosexual relationships, but they had strict rules about dominance. A Roman man, especially the emperor, was always supposed to be the active partner. Always. Elagabalus threw that rule book out the window and set it on fire. He formally married several men, starting with his charioteer Hierocles. But here's what scandalized Rome. Elagabalus took the role of wife in these relationships. He'd appear at official functions in women's clothing. He demanded to be addressed with feminine titles. According to Cassius Dio, he would refer to Hierocles as his husband and himself as Hierocles' wife in both private and public settings. Later, he married Zodicus, a blonde slave from Smyrna. The emperor had selected him through an empire-wide search for physical perfection. Again, the emperor positioned himself as the wife. He appeared in elaborate feminine dress. He insisted the court treat his marriage as legitimate. The Historia Augusta claims he consulted physicians about physical transformation. He offered vast rewards to any doctor who could surgically alter his body to match what he saw as his true identity. Whether this actually happened, the rumors alone were enough to scandalize Rome. Some modern historians suggest Elagabalus might have been transgender in contemporary terms. What's certain is that his behavior was revolutionary in the most literal sense. It threatened the entire foundation of imperial authority, which was built on traditional masculine power. The emperor wasn't just a political leader. He was the living embodiment of Roman virtus, the masculine ideal that justified Rome's dominion over the world. Romans believed their empire succeeded because Roman men were fundamentally more masculine than conquered peoples. Now their emperor was publicly rejecting that entire worldview. The reaction was swift and harsh. Senators who had tolerated foreign religions and unusual habits found themselves facing something that challenged the very nature of power itself. If the ultimate symbol of Roman masculine authority could become a wife, what did that say about the empire they served? Religion in Rome wasn't just personal belief. It was the organizing principle that held a multicultural empire together. The system worked because it was flexible. Egyptian Isis could be worshipped alongside Roman Venus, Germanic war gods next to Roman Mars. The key was balance. Foreign gods were welcome as long as they didn't threaten the traditional Roman pantheon. Elagabalus shattered this balance in the most provocative way imaginable. He arrived in Rome carrying a large black meteorite, the sacred stone that Syrians believed was their sun god Elagabal in physical form. This wasn't unprecedented. Foreign cult objects had come to Rome before, but Elagabalus had no intention of integration. He announced that his Syrian deity wasn't merely equal to Roman gods, he was superior to all of them. To make this concrete, he began systematic religious humiliation. The sacred objects of Jupiter, king of the gods and protector of Rome, were physically removed from their ancient temples. They were forced to bow before the Syrian meteorite in elaborate ceremonies designed to demonstrate their submission. Perhaps most shockingly, he targeted the sacred fire of Vesta. This flame had burned continuously for over 600 years. It wasn't merely a religious symbol, it was Rome's literal life force. Roman tradition held that as long as the fire burned, the city would endure. If it went out, Rome would fall. Herodianus describes how Elagabalus attempted to extinguish this sacred flame and transfer its power to his own god. The Vestal virgins who tended the fire were forced to participate in Syrian ceremonies that violated their vows. Some reportedly committed suicide rather than submit to what they saw as sacrilege. He also imported Syrian religious practices that included ecstatic dancing, ritual self-mutilation, and, according to some sources, human sacrifice. These were practices Rome had banned centuries earlier as barbaric. The emperor forced the entire Senate to participate in these foreign rituals. Imagine Rome's most distinguished citizens being compelled to dance around a black stone while teenage Syrian priests chanted in languages they didn't understand. Contemporary accounts describe senators weeping with humiliation as they performed what they considered degrading and blasphemous acts. The final insult came when Elagabalus arranged a sacred marriage between his god Elagabal and Minerva, the Roman goddess of wisdom. In Syrian tradition, this might have been meaningful spiritual symbolism. To Romans, it was cosmic rape, their ancient virgin goddess violated by a foreign interloper. This wasn't religious reform. It was cultural warfare designed to erase Roman identity and replace it with something completely foreign. Everything we've covered so far was public knowledge. But according to our sources, the most horrific aspects of Elagabalus's reign happened behind closed doors. All three major historians describe a pattern of sexual violence and psychological torture that went beyond anything previous emperors had done. Cassius Dio, who was actually serving in the Senate during this time, provides the most disturbing details. He describes how Elagabalus would systematically target high-ranking senators and their families for sexual humiliation, viewing the degradation of Rome's elite as entertainment. These weren't random acts of lust. They were calculated psychological operations designed to break the spirits of potential opponents. Distinguished senators who had commanded legions were forced to perform degrading sexual acts, while other palace residents watched and laughed. The emperor seemed fascinated by role reversal, compelling traditionally dominant figures to assume positions of submission. Military commanders who had led Rome's armies were made to dress as women and serve as prostitutes at palace parties. Elderly senators were forced into humiliating sexual displays that mocked their age and status. But the abuse extended beyond politicians. Herodianus describes how palace servants lived in constant terror, never knowing when they might be selected for the emperor's attention. Unlike previous emperors who might abuse slaves impulsively, Elagabalus approached torture systematically, experimenting with different methods and documenting results. He kept detailed records of victims' reactions, noting which forms of pain produced the most interesting responses. Some servants were tortured purely for his scientific curiosity about human suffering. Others were killed in elaborate ways designed to test theories about death and dying. The Historia Augusta describes how he would force young aristocratic children into sexual slavery, sometimes castrating boys to serve in his religious ceremonies. Multiple sources hint at human sacrifice, something Romans had banned centuries earlier as barbaric. The victims were chosen not for crimes, but for symbolic value, or simply because the emperor found their suffering aesthetically pleasing. What emerges is a portrait of someone who had lost all connection to basic human empathy. This wasn't traditional cruelty. This was systematic dehumanization by someone who viewed other people as objects to be manipulated and discarded for his own gratification. The psychological impact on palace survivors was severe. Many reportedly suffered what we'd now recognize as trauma, unable to sleep, haunted by nightmares, jumping at unexpected sounds. The imperial palace had become a house of horrors that people entered only when compelled. By 222 AD, even Elagabalus's own family had reached the breaking point. Julia Maesa, the grandmother who had orchestrated his rise to power, watched in horror as her teenage protege systematically destroyed everything she had worked to achieve. Maesa was nothing if not pragmatic. She could see that his behavior was threatening not just his own reign, but the entire imperial system that kept her family in power. Quietly, she began promoting Elagabalus's younger cousin, Alexander Severus, as a potential alternative. Unlike his older cousin, Alexander had been raised with traditional Roman values and showed none of Elagabalus's psychological instability. The transition began subtly. Alexander appeared at more ceremonies. He took on administrative duties. He met with key military commanders. But Elagabalus wasn't blind to what was happening. As reports reached him about his cousin's growing popularity, his behavior became even more erratic and violent. He began executing palace staff on mere suspicion of disloyalty and threatened to have Alexander killed. The final crisis came in March 222 AD. Elagabalus summoned the Praetorian Guard and announced his intention to execute Alexander Severus and several family members for treason. This was the moment when even his most loyal supporters realized their emperor had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The Praetorian Guard were professional soldiers who understood that their own survival depended on the stability of the imperial system. If Elagabalus destroyed his own family in a paranoid rage, who would be next? The decision was swift and unanimous. These weren't rebels. In their minds, they were patriots saving Rome from a monster who had acquired the purple robes of imperial authority. When the Praetorian Guards finally cornered Elagabalus in that palace bathroom, they weren't just killing an emperor, they were performing an exorcism on the Roman Empire itself. 4 years. That's all it took for absolute power to transform a 14-year-old boy into something so monstrous that his own grandmother ordered his death. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that make us most uncomfortable, the ones that remind us what we're capable of becoming when power meets madness, and no one has the courage to say enough until it's almost too late.